Report 1. The Turpin Family. The story of the Turpin family is a narrative that defies human understanding, a tale of horror that unfolded silently for decades in a seemingly ordinary house in the quiet city of Paris, California. David and Louise Turpin, a couple who met when they were young, built a large family over the years, culminating in 13 children. To the outside world, they presented themselves as a big and, at first glance, happy family, occasionally attending the local church and discreetly participating in community events. The facade of normality that the Turpins maintained was meticulously constructed, a strategy of social camouflage to avoid suspicion. David, a man of ordinary appearance, worked as an engineer at Northrop Grumman, a respected aerospace defense company, where he dealt with projects involving communication systems and cutting-edge technology. Louise, a housewife, appeared to be a dedicated mother, always smiling and helpful in superficial interactions with neighbors. The family's rare public appearances were carefully orchestrated, with the children dressed identically, often in homemade clothes that reinforced the image of a united and modest family, creating a picture of unity and harmony that masked the terrible reality hidden behind the walls of their home. For example, on a visit to Disneyland, they all wore identical shirts, a scene that, in hindsight, sounds disturbingly rehearsed. Neighbors, when questioned later, remembered seeing the Turpin children only occasionally. When they did appear, they were described as pale, excessively thin, and with strangely withdrawn behavior, avoiding eye contact and rarely speaking. One neighbor recalled seeing the children marching in single file inside the house, behavior that at the time seemed merely peculiar, but would later be understood as a sign of the absolute control exercised by the parents, a form of militaristic discipline imposed from childhood. Other neighbors mentioned that when trying to greet the children, they received only blank stares or monosyllabic responses, which they attributed to shyness. The Turpin house, a common-looking structure in a suburban neighborhood, concealed a world of unimaginable horrors. Behind the closed curtains and locked doors, the 13 Turpin children lived an existence that bordered on torture. The children were regularly chained to their beds, often for weeks or even months at a time. The chains, improvised with padlocks and ropes, were so tight that they left deep marks on the skin, some of which would take years to heal completely, resulting in keloids and hyperpigmentation. In some cases, the chains were fastened to wrists and ankles, drastically limiting blood circulation and causing chronic numbness. The children's feeding was not only scarce but also cruel in its application, a classic example of psychological torture. The parents often prepared elaborate meals for themselves, eating them in front of their starving children, displaying dishes such as roast chicken, mashed potatoes, and fresh salads. The children were forced to watch, smelling the food, but forbidden to touch or eat. When they finally received food, it was usually something of low nutritional value, such as instant noodles, gakur ramen noodles, or white bread sandwiches with processed cheese, a diet that lacked essential vitamins and minerals. This constant food deprivation resulted in severe malnutrition, with some of the older children weighing less than 90 pounds when they were finally rescued, showing symptoms of marasmus and kwashiorkor. Hygiene was a luxury denied to the Turpin children. Baths were allowed only once a year, sometimes less. Bathroom use was strictly controlled, and often the children were forced to urinate and defecate in their own clothes, creating an unsanitary environment prone to infections. The accumulation of dirt and odors in the house was so intense that neighbors occasionally complained about the smell emanating from the property, never imagining the true source of the problem, attributing the odor to plumbing issues or garbage accumulation. The children's education was a cruel farce. Although officially registered for homeschooling, the reality was that many of the older children could barely read or write, struggling to recognize even the letters of the alphabet. David Turpin had registered a private school in his home, which allowed him to avoid regular inspections, circumventing education laws and maintaining the children's isolation. Classes at Canal, when they occurred, were superficial and inadequate, consisting mainly of reading Bible passages and memorizing random facts, leaving the children with extremely limited knowledge of the world around them. and without critical thinking skills. The isolation imposed on the Turpin children was almost total, a form of sensory deprivation. They rarely left the house and were forbidden from interacting with other people, even if it was to play with other children in the neighborhood. When occasional visits occurred, usually from distant relatives, the children were instructed to remain completely quiet and still, as if they were inanimate objects. An aunt reported visiting the house and noticing the children sitting in chairs, not moving or speaking for hours, behavior that at the time seemed strange but not alarming enough to raise serious suspicions, a tragic failure in perceiving warning signs. The control exercised by David and Louise over their children was absolute and terrifying, characterizing an environment of coercive control. Punishments for minor infractions, such as speaking loudly or not following instructions to the letter, included beatings, prolonged isolation in dark rooms, and food deprivation. The children lived in a constant state of fear, never knowing when or why they would be punished. This constant terror created a complex psychological bond between the victims and their abusers, known as Stockholm Syndrome, which would further complicate the children's subsequent recovery, leading them to develop feelings of loyalty and even affection for their tormentors. Years passed, and the suffering of the Turpin children continued. Invisible to the outside world, the older children became adults but remained prisoners, their bodies and minds atrophied by continuous abuse. It was only in January 2018 that a glimmer of hope emerged in the form of one of the daughters, then 17 years old, who made the courageous decision to escape down, an act of agency amidst a sea of oppression. The escape was an act of extraordinary bravery. The young woman, who barely knew what the outside world was like, had planned her escape for 2 years, studying her parents, schedules, and looking for opportunities to act. She managed to hide an old, deactivated cell phone she found in the house, keeping it hidden in a secret compartment under her bed. In the early hours of January 14, 2018, taking advantage of a rare moment when she wasn't chained, she escaped through a window, forcing the rusty lock with a sharp object. Her feet, unaccustomed to walking, barely supported her as she ran down the dark street, feeling the cold asphalt beneath her bare feet. With the old cell phone, she managed to call 911. The conversation with the emergency dispatcher was surreal. The young woman could barely explain where she lived or what an address was, demonstrating a lack of basic knowledge of the outside world. She didn't know what medicines were and became confused when asked if anyone in the house needed medical care, revealing the extent of the medical neglect suffered. However, she knew she needed help and that her siblings were in danger, conveying the urgency of the situation with surprising clarity. When authorities arrived at the Turpin home, they were shocked by what they found. The odor emanating from the residence was so strong that police officers needed to wear masks, protecting themselves against the risk of respiratory infections. Inside, they found children chained to beds, some already adults, but so malnourished they looked half their actual age. A visual testimony to the brutality of the abuse. The house was in a state of complete abandonment, with human and animal feces scattered everywhere, rotten food and garbage accumulated in every room, creating an unhealthy and dangerous environment for health. The rescue of the Turpin children was a delicate process. Many were so fragile that they had to be carried out of the house on stretchers. Some, upon seeing the police officers, became frightened, screaming and crying, having never interacted with strangers before, showing signs of acute stress disorder. The scene was so shocking that even the most experienced police officers were emotionally shaken, requiring psychological support after the operation. David and Louise Turpin were immediately arrested, appearing surprised and indignant, as if they didn't understand the gravity of their actions, demonstrating a lack of insight into the severity of their crimes. The 13 children, ranging in age from 2 to 29, were taken to local hospitals for urgent medical care. The health condition of many of them was critical, with problems ranging from severe malnutrition to brain damage caused by lack of proper oxygenation due to tight chains, as well as psychological problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and attachment disorders. In the days and weeks that followed, the world was shocked by the revelations about the Turpin case. The Paris community, which until then was unaware of the drama unfolding in its midst, was deeply shaken. Neighbors who had occasionally seen the Turpins expressed disbelief and guilt for not having noticed the signs of abuse, questioning whether they could have done something to help. The adaptation of the Turpin children to normal life was a slow and challenging process, requiring a multidisciplinary approach involving doctors, psychologists, social workers, and educators. Many had never experienced simple things like brushing their teeth, taking regular baths, or eating 3 meals a day, requiring training in basic hygiene and nutrition skills. The outside world was completely new and sometimes frightening to them. Basic concepts such as money, work, and social relationships were strange and confusing, requiring a gradual learning process adapted to their individual needs. The younger children seemed to have suffered less psychological damage and adapted more quickly, demonstrating a greater capacity for resilience. However, the older ones showed clear signs of deep trauma, such as flashbacks, nightmares, and difficulties in trusting other people. Some could barely walk due to prolonged confinement and lack of exercise, requiring intensive physical therapy. The process of physical and emotional recovery promised to be long and complex, requiring years of therapy and specialized care, including cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy, EMDR. The community mobilized in an extraordinary way to help the victims. Support funds were created to cover the medical, therapeutic, and educational expenses of the Turpin children, raising millions of dollars in donations. Volunteers offered to assist in the process of adapting to normal life, teaching them basic skills and offering emotional support, acting as mentors and friends. The generosity of people moved by the Turpin story was a beacon of hope amid the darkness, demonstrating the power of empathy and solidarity. One of the most touching stories emerged from one of the older daughters, who, despite all the abuse suffered, managed to secretly keep a diary, hiding it from her parents in a secret location. In it, she wrote songs and poems, dreaming of a day when she and her siblings would be free, expressing her hope and resilience through art. This diary, discovered after the rescue, became not only crucial evidence in the case against the parents, but also a powerful symbol of the resilience of the human spirit, inspiring other abuse victims to seek help and believe in a better future. The Turpin case raised important questions about child protection systems and homeschooling surveillance, exposing flaws and gaps in supervisory mechanisms. How was it possible that such abuse had occurred for so long without being detected? Authorities began to reassess policies and procedures related to homeschooling and social worker visits, seeking to strengthen the protection of children in vulnerable situations. Meanwhile, David and Louise Turpin faced the legal consequences of their actions. The charges against them included torture, child abuse, false imprisonment, and neglect, crimes that carried severe penalties. The trial promised to be one of the most shocking in recent California history, attracting international media attention and generating debates about the nature of evil and the importance of justice. As more details about the Turpin children's lives came to light, the public became increasingly horrified. It was discovered that the children had been so isolated that some didn't know what a window was or had never seen a street, demonstrating a lack of familiarity with the outside world that was almost unbelievable. One of the older daughters reported that her only contact with the outside world was through old movies they were occasionally allowed to watch, a limited and distorted form of experience that did not substitute for interaction with reality. The recovery of the Turpin children became a journey followed by millions of people around the world. Every small progress, the first time one of the older children managed to walk without help, the first genuine smile from one of the younger ones, the first time a teenager managed to read an entire book, was celebrated as a victory against the abuse they had suffered, a testimony to the strength of the human spirit. The challenges faced by the Turpin siblings were immense. Beyond physical and emotional recovery, they needed to learn to navigate a world that was completely foreign to them. Simple things like shopping in a supermarket, using a cell phone, or interacting with strangers were new and often frightening experiences, requiring patience, understanding, and ongoing support. Despite all the obstacles, The Turpin siblings demonstrated remarkable resilience. Many expressed the desire to study, work, and have a normal life, seeking opportunities to build a better future for themselves. One of the older sisters even enrolled in college, determined to make up for lost time and build a better future for herself, becoming an example of overcoming adversity and inspiration. The story of the Turpin family continues to impact those who know it. It's a grim reminder of the horrors that can hide behind normal facades, but also a story of hope and triumph of the human spirit over unimaginable adversities. For the 13 Turpin children, each new day brings challenges, but also the promise of a life they can finally call their own, a life free from fear and oppression. Report 2, the Natasha case. The case of Natasha Kampusch is a story that shocked the world and continues to intrigue people to this day. On March 6, 1998, on a seemingly ordinary morning in Vienna, Austria, the life of a 10-year-old girl changed forever. Natasha, a child with blonde hair and bright eyes, left home for school as she did every day. However, that morning, she would not reach her destination. Wolfgang Psychlopel, a 36-year-old communications technician, was lurking in a white van. When Natasha passed by, he quickly grabbed her and threw her into the vehicle. In a matter of minutes, the girl disappeared without a trace, beginning a frantic search that would last for years. Natasha's disappearance caused a stir in Austria. Posters with her face were spread throughout Vienna, and desperate appeals from her parents were regularly broadcast on television. The police investigated hundreds of leads, but none led to Natasha. As time passed, many began to believe she would never be found. While the outside world was looking for her, Natasha was trapped in a nightmare. Psychlopel took her to his house in Strasshof, a small town on the outskirts of Vienna. There, he forced her down into a small basement under his garage, a space of only 5 square meters that would become her home for the next 8.5 years. Natasha's captivity was a tiny cell, carefully planned by Psychlopel. The walls were reinforced with concrete, and the only entrance was a steel door with an electronic lock. There were no windows, just a small ventilation tube. The space was so tight that Natasha could barely stand up. In the first months, Natasha lived in complete darkness. Psychlopel kept her locked up for days, sometimes weeks, without human contact. Food was scarce and of low quality, often just leftovers from what he ate. The isolation and sensory deprivation were ways to break the girl's spirit, a cruel tactic to make her dependent on her captor. Psychlopel exercised absolute control over all aspects of Natasha's life. He decided when she could eat, sleep, use the bathroom, or take a shower. Even the air she breathed was controlled by him. Through the ventilation system he could turn on or off at will. Over time, Psychlopel began to allow Natasha to occasionally leave the basement for the main house. However, these outings were always under strict surveillance and accompanied by threats. He told her that the house was surrounded by alarms, and that if she tried to escape, he would kill her and then kill himself. Despite the terrible conditions, Natasha fought to maintain her sanity and identity. She kept small objects from her previous life, a piece of soap, a toothbrush, as precious reminders of who she was. In secret, she also kept a diary, writing her thoughts and feelings on scraps of paper that she carefully hid. As Natasha grew, Psychlopel began to allow her to perform household chores in the house. She cleaned, cooked, and even helped with construction projects. These tasks, although performed under coercion, gave Natasha a sense of purpose and a connection, albeit distorted, to the outside world. Psychlopel tried to mold Natasha in his image. He forced her to call herself Bibiana and insisted she speak in classical German rather than the Austrian dialect. He rigorously controlled her diet, determining every calorie she consumed in a perverse attempt to keep her body small and childlike. Despite Psychlopel's efforts to erase her identity, Natasha clung tenaciously to memories of her previous life. She remembered her mother's face, the sound of her father's voice, playing with her siblings. These memories were a mental refuge, a place where she could escape from the brutal reality of her captivity. As the years passed, the relationship between Natasha and Psychlopil became increasingly complex. He alternated between moments of apparent kindness and outbursts of brutal violence. Sometimes he would give her gifts or take her on quick car rides. On other occasions, he would savagely beat her for minimal infractions. As Natasha grew older, Psychlopil began to see her not just as a prisoner, but as a kind of companion. He forced her to participate in domestic activities, such as watching TV or having dinner together, in a grotesque parody of domestic normality. These moments of pseudo-normality were particularly disturbing for Natasha, blurring the lines between captor and victim. Despite the psychological control exercised by Psychlopil, Natasha never stopped dreaming of freedom. She closely observed her captor's routine, looking for flaws in his vigilance. She knew that if she wanted to escape, she would have to be patient and wait for the right moment. On August 23, 2006, after 3,096 days of captivity, that moment finally came. Natasha, now 18, was cleaning and vacuuming Psychlopil's car in the garage. Psychlopil received a call on his cell phone and stepped away to answer it, leaving Natasha unsupervised for a few crucial minutes. Natasha didn't hesitate. With her heart racing, she dropped the vacuum cleaner and ran. She jumped over fences of neighboring gardens, desperate to distance herself as much as possible from her captivity. Finally, she reached a house where a woman was watering plants in the garden. Breathless and shaking, Natasha approached the woman. "I am Natasha Kampusch," she said, the words coming out in a rushed gush. The woman, shocked, immediately called the police. After almost a decade, Natasha was finally free. The news of Natasha's escape spread quickly. Within hours, the whole world knew that the long-missing girl had been found. The media went into a frenzy, and Natasha's story dominated global headlines. Meanwhile, Psychlopil had realized Natasha's escape and panicked. He fled, driving erratically through the city. When it became clear there was no escape, he made a final, desperate decision. On the night of August 23rd, Psychlopil threw himself in front of a moving train, taking his own life and taking with him many of the answers about Natasha's captivity. The first days after Natasha's rescue were a whirlwind. She was reunited with her family, a moment charged with emotion and complexity. Her parents, who had aged with pain and uncertainty, could hardly believe their daughter was alive and back. The world was eager to hear Natasha's story, but she needed time to process her experience. She was taken to a secure location, where she received medical care and psychological support. Doctors were impressed with her physical and mental strength, considering the circumstances of her captivity. In the months that followed, Natasha began to tell her story, first to the authorities and then, gradually, to the public. Her first interviews revealed an articulate and surprisingly composed young woman, able to speak about her experience with impressive clarity. Natasha's readjustment to society was a complex process. She had to learn to navigate a world that had changed drastically during her years of captivity. Technologies such as cell phones and the internet were new to her, and she had to quickly familiarize herself with these modern tools. One of the biggest challenges for Natasha was dealing with intense media attention. Reporters constantly followed her, eager for every detail of her story. This constant pressure was difficult for someone who had spent so much time isolated from the world. Despite the challenges, Natasha demonstrated remarkable resilience. She began to rebuild her life, focusing on her education and personal development. She studied intensively to make up for the lost years of schooling, determined not to let her captivity define her future. In 2008, Natasha took a significant step in her healing journey by publishing her autobiography, 3,096 Days. The book, which became an international bestseller, offered a detailed and moving account of her years in captivity. Through writing, Natasha was able to process her experience and share her story on her own terms. Natasha's case generated intense discussions about the psychology of prolonged captivity. Many were intrigued by the complexity of her relationship with Psychlopil, raising questions about Stockholm Syndrome and survival mechanisms in extreme situations. Natasha surprised many by expressing conflicting feelings about her captor after his death. She spoke about moments of apparent kindness from Psychlopal, bewildering those who expected only hatred and anger. These statements generated controversy, but also highlighted the psychological complexity of her experience. In the years following her rescue, Natasha became a public figure in Austria. She hosted a talk show on Austrian television, where she interviewed other people who had gone through traumatic experiences. Through this work, she was able to use her own experience to help others deal with trauma. Natasha also became an activist, using her platform to advocate for causes related to children's rights and abuse prevention. She worked with charity organizations and spoke at international conferences, sharing her story to raise awareness about child abduction and abuse. Natasha's story continued to fascinate the public long after her rescue. Books, documentaries, and even a movie were produced about her experience, each trying to understand and portray the years she spent in captivity. In 2013, new revelations about the case emerged when an Austrian parliamentary commission published a report criticizing the original investigation of Natasha's disappearance. The report pointed out significant flaws in the police investigation, raising questions about whether Natasha could have been found earlier. These revelations were difficult for Natasha, rekindling painful memories and raising questions about what could have been. However, she continued to focus on moving forward, refusing to be defined solely by her past. Over the years, Natasha continued to make public appearances, though less frequently. She expressed a desire to lead a more normal life, away from the media spotlight. In occasional interviews, she spoke about her efforts to build relationships, pursue personal interests, and find a sense of normalcy in her life. A particularly intriguing aspect of Natasha's story was her decision to retain ownership of the house where she was held captive. She inherited the house after Psychlopal's death and chose not to sell or demolish it. This decision generated much speculation and discussion, with Natasha explaining that the house was a part of her life that she didn't want to deny or forget. In 2016, on the 10th anniversary of her escape, Natasha gave a series of reflective interviews. She spoke about how she had changed in the decades since her rescue, about her ongoing efforts to process her experience, and about her hopes for the future. These interviews showed a woman who, despite carrying the scars of her past, was determined to live her life on her own terms. Report 3. The J.C. Lee Case. The case of J.C. Lee Dugard is a story that shocked the world and continues to be a grim reminder of the dangers that can lurk in seemingly tranquil communities. On June 10, 1991, a morning like any other in South Lake Tahoe, California, the life of an 11-year-old girl changed forever. J.C., a girl with blonde hair and bright eyes, left home that morning to catch the school bus. Dressed in a pink jacket and black leggings, she was walking down the familiar street when a car approached. In a matter of seconds, J.C. was pulled into the vehicle by a man, while a woman drove. The abduction happened so quickly that J.C.'s stepfather, who was watching from the garage, barely had time to react. The kidnappers were Philip and Nancy Garrido. Philip, a 40-year-old man at the time, already had a criminal history, including a previous conviction for kidnapping and rape. Nancy warned his wife was complicit in his terrible plan. They took J.C. to their home in Antioch, California, about 170 miles away from South Lake Tahoe. Upon arriving at the Garridos' property, J.C. was immediately taken to the backyard. There, hidden from neighbors, viewed by high fences and dense vegetation, was a complex of makeshift tents and sheds. This would be J.C.'s home for the next 18 years. In the first days of her captivity, J.C. was kept handcuffed and locked in a room. Philip Garrido terrorized her with threats and abuse, while Nancy acted as a silent accomplice. J.C., scared and confused, had no idea where she was or what would happen to her. As time passed, J.C.'s life in captivity took on a terrible routine. She lived in a tent in the backyard, isolated from the outside world. Philip Garrido visited her regularly, subjecting her to repeated sexual abuse. Nancy Garrido, although not directly participating in the abuse, helped keep J.C. captive and often acted as a distorted mother figure. J.C. was kept in almost total isolation. She had no access to formal education, medical care, or contact with the outside world. Her only companions were the Garridos themselves, and, eventually, pets she was allowed to have. At 14, just 3 years after her abduction, JC gave birth to her first daughter. The delivery happened in the tent, without medical assistance. 3 years later, at 17, she had her second daughter. Philip Garrido was the father of both children. These children, born and raised in captivity, knew no other reality beyond the confined world of the Garridos' backyard. The lives of JC and her daughters were meticulously controlled by the Garridos. They lived in makeshift tents and sheds in the backyard, hidden from neighbors' view. The girls were taught to call JC sister and the Garridos mom and dad. JC was forced to adopt the name Alyssa to hide her true identity. Despite the isolation, the Garridos occasionally allowed JC to leave the property. These outings were always under strict supervision, and JC was presented as a relative or daughter of the Garridos. The fear and psychological manipulation were so intense that JC never attempted to ask for help during these rare outings. Over time, Philip Garrido began to use JC in his printing business. She interacted with customers via email and phone, always using her fake name. This limited interaction with the outside world was strictly controlled by the Garridos, who monitored all communications. Throughout the years, there were moments when JC's discovery was dangerously close. Neighbors occasionally reported suspicious activities on the Garridos' property, and Philip Garrido, as a registered sex offender, received regular visits from parole officers. However, through a combination of negligence, incompetence, and the Garridos' ability to hide their crime, JC remained undiscovered for nearly 2 decades. The turning point in JC's case began in August 2009, when Philip Garrido, accompanied by JC's 2 daughters, attended an event on the University of California, Berkeley campus. Garrido's strange behavior and the girls' appearance caught the attention of campus officers, who notified Garrido's parole officer. In the following days, a series of events unfolded rapidly. Garrido was called to a meeting with his parole officer, where he was questioned about the girls. Under pressure, he eventually revealed the existence of JC and her daughters. On August 26, 2009, JC Lee Dugard, now 29 years old, was finally rescued after 18 years of captivity. The rescue of JC and her daughters shocked the world. The news spread quickly, and the story of the kidnapped girl who had been found alive after so long captured global attention. JC was reunited with her mother, Terry Probin, in an emotional encounter that marked the beginning of her journey back to the world she had left behind so long ago. The first days after the rescue were a whirlwind for JC and her daughters. They were taken to a safe location, where they received urgently needed medical care and psychological support. The challenge of readjusting to the outside world after so long in isolation was immense. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including kidnapping and sexual abuse. The case generated public outrage and raised serious questions about how Philip Garrido, a registered sex offender, could have kept JC captive for so long without being discovered. In the months following her rescue, JC began the long process of readjusting to freedom. She had to deal not only with the trauma of her captivity, but also with the task of learning to navigate a world that had changed drastically during the 18 years she had been missing. Technologies such as cell phones, internet, and social media were completely new to her. One of the biggest challenges for JC was raising her daughters. The girls, who had been born and raised in captivity, had to adapt to a totally new and unknown world. JC took on the difficult task of helping her daughters adjust, while she herself was still learning to cope with her new reality. JC's story attracted intense media attention. Reporters and cameras constantly followed her, eager for details of her experience. This additional pressure made the readjustment process even more challenging for JC and her daughters, who desired privacy to process their experiences and begin to heal. In 2011, 2 years after her rescue, JC published her memoir, A Stolen Life. The book offered a detailed and moving account of her years in captivity, as well as her reflections on freedom and the healing process. The publication of the book was an important step in JC's journey to regain control of her narrative and use her experience to help others. JC's book became an instant bestseller, touching readers worldwide with its raw honesty and message of hope and resilience. Through her words, JC was able to give voice not only to her own experience, but also to that of other victims of kidnapping and abuse. After the publication of her book, JC began to become more actively involved in advocacy and victim support work. She founded the JAYC Foundation, an organization dedicated to supporting families recovering from kidnapping and other traumatic experiences. The foundation offers services such as counseling, educational support, and practical assistance for victims and their families. Through her work with the foundation, JC found a new purpose. She became a powerful voice in advocating for victims' rights and raising awareness about child abduction and abuse. Her personal experiences gave her a unique and valuable perspective on these issues. JC's case also led to significant changes in policies and practices for supervising registered sex offenders. The failures that allowed Philip Garrido to keep JC captive for so long, despite being a registered sex offender, led to a review of monitoring and supervision procedures in many jurisdictions. In the years following her rescue, JC continued to work on her healing and that of her daughters. She sought intensive therapy and other treatments to deal with the trauma of her years in captivity. At the same time, she strived to create a normal life for herself and her daughters, seeking experiences and opportunities that had been denied to them for so long. A particularly challenging aspect of JC's recovery was dealing with the complex feelings she had towards the Garridos. Years of psychological manipulation and forced dependence created a complicated dynamic that would take time to fully process and overcome. In 2016, JC published a second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts, in which she shared her experiences of rediscovering the world after her rescue. The book detailed many of the firsts that JC experienced after her liberation, from her first cup of coffee to her first plane trip. These stories offered a moving glimpse into JC's process of reconnecting with the world. Over the years, JC has made occasional public appearances, speaking at conferences and events about her experience and advocacy work. She has become a powerful speaker, able to communicate the realities of trauma and recovery in a way that resonates deeply with her audience. A notable aspect of JC's story is her determination not to let her past define her future. Although she never denies or minimizes her experiences, she refuses to be seen only as a victim. Instead, she sees herself as a survivor and an advocate, using her platform to make a difference in the lives of others. Education has been an important part of JC's journey since her rescue. Deprived of formal education during her years in captivity, she has worked diligently to make up for lost time. She obtained her GED, high school equivalent, and continued to pursue educational opportunities, demonstrating a thirst for knowledge and growth. JC's daughters, now young adults, have also been working to build their own lives. Although details of their lives are kept private, JC occasionally shares updates on their progress and growth. The fact that these young women, born in such terrible circumstances, have the opportunity to live normal lives is a testament to JC's strength and determination as a mother. Report 4. The Elizabeth Case. The case of Elizabeth Smart is a story that shocked the United States and the world, highlighting the dangers that can lurk even in seemingly safe communities. On June 5, 2002, a quiet night in Salt Lake City, Utah, turned into a nightmare for the Smart family. Elizabeth Smart, a 14-year-old girl, was sleeping peacefully in her room, shared with her younger sister, Mary Catherine. Around 2 a.m., an intruder silently entered the Smart home through a kitchen window that had been left open for ventilation. The intruder, later identified as Brian David Mitchell, was a disheveled-looking man who occasionally did odd jobs for the Smart family. He crept into the girls' bedroom, armed with a knife. Mary Catherine, only 9 years old, pretended to be asleep as she watched, terrified. The stranger take her sister. Elizabeth was awakened with a knife at her throat and a harsh voice ordering her to get up silently, threatening to kill her family if she made any noise. Frightened and confused, Elizabeth obeyed, being taken out of her home and into the nearby mountains. The kidnapper, Brian David Mitchell, was a street preacher who called himself Emmanuel. He believed he was a prophet chosen by God and saw Elizabeth as his celestial bride. His wife, Wanda Barzee, was complicit in the kidnapping and subsequent abuse. Mitchell took Elizabeth to a makeshift camp in the mountains, just a few miles from her home. There, in a bizarre ceremony, he married Elizabeth, declaring her his wife in the eyes of God. This ceremony marked the beginning of months of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. During her captivity, Elizabeth was forced to wear strange clothes, including a veil that covered her face when in public. Mitchell renamed her Augustine and insisted she call him Master. He kept her chained to a tree by a steel cable, severely limiting her movements. The first months of captivity were spent in the mountains near the smart home. Mitchell frequently went down to the city to beg or steal supplies. Elizabeth was forced to accompany him on some of these excursions, always veiled and under constant threats. The abuse suffered by Elizabeth was constant and multifaceted. Besides sexual abuse, she was forced to consume alcohol and drugs, which Mitchell used as a form of control. He manipulated her psychologically, alternating between moments of apparent kindness and outbursts of violent anger.